The restaurant, perched atop a Los Angeles skyscraper, was a world meticulously crafted to insulate its patrons from the grit of the city below. The air was a hushed symphony of discreetly clinking silverware, the low murmur of powerful conversations, and the scent of saffron and old money. Through the panoramic, floor-to-ceiling windows, the sprawling city lights glittered like a conquered galaxy. At the center of this universe sat Richard Whitman, a man whose ambition was as vast and as cold as the view. He was in the middle of a performance, a well-rehearsed ballet of corporate charm, and his audience was a single, immensely important man, Mr. Tanaka Kenji, a Japanese tech billionaire whose investment could redefine Whitman's empire. The final act of the performance required a prop. Whitman's gaze swept the room and landed on Lian Chen, a waitress moving with a quiet, almost invisible efficiency. He signaled her over, a curt, imperious flick of his fingers. "Our sommelier will now recommend a wine," he announced to Mr. Tanaka, the word sommelier dripping with a sarcasm that was a private joke for his American colleagues. He then turned to Lian, his smile a thin, cruel line. "Tell us, what do you recommend?" He deliberately mimicked the soft, almost melodic lilt of her Asian American accent. "Something exotic, perhaps." The barely concealed mockery hung in the air, a small, ugly cloud in the otherwise perfect atmosphere. Mr. Tanaka, a man of profound old-world dignity, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Lian did not flinch. She simply inclined her head, her expression a mask of professional serenity. She looked not at Whitman, but directly at Mr. Tanaka, and then she did the impossible. She spoke. Not in English, with the accent Whitman had so cruelly aped, but in flawless, academically precise Mandarin, a language she knew Mr. Tanaka, a global investor, would understand. "Given the delicate flavor profile of the chef's sea bass, a wine with high acidity could overwhelm the dish, sir," she began, her tone respectful but authoritative. "However, I've noticed a discrepancy between the English and the translated Mandarin versions of the contract addendum on your table. Section 3B regarding intellectual property appears to have a critical translation error that could cost your company millions in royalty fees." The table fell silent. The air crackled. Whitman's condescending smirk froze, then evaporated, replaced by a look of pure, uncomprehending shock. Mr. Tanaka, who had been a mask of polite indifference, slowly sat up, his dark, intelligent eyes fixing on Lian with a new and absolute intensity. The power dynamic of the entire multi-billion-dollar evening had just been irrevocably and spectacularly upended by a waitress with a quiet voice and a mind like a steel trap. Richard Whitman was a man who believed he had perfected the art of the deal. His real estate empire was a testament to his personal philosophy, that the world was a chessboard and he was 3 moves ahead of everyone else. He was a master of the calculated risk, the veiled threat, the friendly smile that hid a predator's teeth. He saw business not as a collaboration, but as a hunt, and he had the trophies to prove it. Gleaming skyscrapers in his portfolio, a collection of enemies who had underestimated him, and a reputation for a ruthlessness that was both feared and, in certain circles, admired. His world was a fortress of his own making, and the crack in its foundation was a profound, almost pathological contempt for anything he perceived as weak. He had clawed his way up from a middle-class background, and he wore his success like armor, a constant, glittering rebuke to the world he had left behind. In his mind, there were 2 kinds of people: The powerful, like him, and the powerless, the vast, faceless sea of staff and help who existed to facilitate his ascent. The deal with Mr. Tanaka was to be his magnum opus, a legacy-defining project to build a state-of-the-art international tech campus in the heart of Los Angeles. It was a deal that would not just make him richer, it would make him a visionary, a man who had brought the future to his city. And he was willing to do anything to close it. He was, in the quiet, unexamined corners of his own soul, a profoundly insecure man, and his arrogance was the overcompensation for a deep-seated fear of being seen as the small, striving boy he had once been. This insecurity manifested as a particular, venomous disdain for women in positions of authority and for anyone whose speech or mannerisms deviated from his own narrow, anglicized standard of power. He was so blinded by this prejudice that he had become incapable of seeing the world clearly. He saw Lian Chen's quiet, professional demeanor and mistook it for subservience. He heard the gentle lilt in her accent and mistook it for a lack of sophistication. He saw a young Asian-American woman in a server's uniform, and his mind, a machine of lazy, self-serving categorizations, had already dismissed her. He had, without a second thought, relegated her to the vast, invisible landscape of the powerless. It did not and could not occur to him that she might be the most dangerous person in the room. He believed he was the one setting the traps, never once suspecting that his own profound, unexamined bigotry was the greatest trap of all. Lian Chen's life was a quiet, 20-year-long act of preparation for this very moment. She was not a waitress, she was a hunter, and Richard Whitman was the prey she had been stalking for more than half her life. Her quiet, scholarly father, a brilliant and trusting man, had been one of Whitman's first business partners. He had run a small but innovative import-export business, Chen Imports, and Whitman, then a young, hungry, and utterly ruthless developer, had approached him with a proposal for a joint venture. It was a deal that promised to make them both rich. Instead, it had destroyed him. Lian, then just a 10-year-old girl, had been a silent witness to her father's slow, agonizing decline. She remembered the late-night arguments, the stacks of legal papers on the dining room table, the way the light had slowly, irrevocably gone out of her father's eyes. Whitman, using a series of cleverly worded, deceptively translated contracts, a tactic that was now his signature, had systematically stripped her father of his assets, his business, and finally, his reputation. The official story was that Chen Imports had gone bankrupt due to mismanagement. The truth, a truth her father had whispered to her on his deathbed, was that it had been a murder, a slow, bloodless corporate execution. "He used my own language against me, Lian," her father had said, his voice a dry, rattling whisper. "He made me believe I was signing a partnership, but I was signing my own death warrant." After his death, which the doctors attributed to a stress-induced heart attack, but which Lian knew was from a broken heart, she had made a quiet, solemn vow. She would not seek revenge, she would seek justice. Her life since then had been a study in disciplined, focused preparation. She had excelled in school, not for the love of learning, but for the acquisition of weapons. She had earned a dual master's degree, not in one subject, but in the two that had been used to destroy her father, finance and the intricate, beautiful, and treacherous world of the Mandarin language. She had spent years working her way up the corporate ladder at a rival firm, her goal never being her own advancement, but the accumulation of knowledge, of understanding the complex global ecosystem in which a predator like Whitman thrived. And when she had learned that he was courting a major investment from the legendary and notoriously honorable Mr. Tanaka Kenji, she knew her moment had arrived. Getting a job as a server at Whitman's flagship restaurant had been the final, most difficult and most brilliant part of her plan. It had given her what years of distant analytical research never could: proximity. It had allowed her to observe him in his natural habitat, to listen to his unguarded conversations, to see the man behind the carefully constructed corporate facade. And what she had seen had only confirmed the cold, hard truth she already knew. He was a man who had not changed, a man who still saw the world and the people in it as tools to be used and discarded. Tucked into her server's apron was not an order pad, but the small, worn fountain pen that had belonged to her father, a quiet, constant reminder of the promise she had made to him so long ago. She was not here to serve a meal. She was here to serve a long overdue and ice-cold dish of justice. The collision was a calculated, theatrical display of dominance, a performance Richard Whitman had perfected over a lifetime of such encounters. He saw the world in terms of hierarchies, of predators and prey, and he had an unerring instinct for establishing his position at the top of the food chain. The moment Lian Chen approached his table, he had made his assessment. She was young, she was a woman, she was Asian American, and she was a server. In his mind, this placed her at the very bottom of the evening's power structure, a perfect, defenseless target for a casual demonstration of his own superiority. His first move was the mock solicitous inquiry about the wine, a question designed not for an answer, but for a display. When she had responded with a quiet, professional competence, he had escalated. The fateful collision was his public and utterly unnecessary mimicking of her accent. It was not a subtle, unintentional slight. It was a deliberate act of caricature, a way of taking a small, personal part of her identity and twisting it into a form of public entertainment for the amusement of his colleagues. He was not just being rude, he was engaging in a ritual of dehumanization, reducing her from a person to a stereotype, a punchline. Mr. Tanaka's visible discomfort at the display was, in Whitman's mind, a sign of weakness, a quaint, old-world sentimentality that had no place in the brutal, modern arena of high-stakes business. He mistook the Japanese billionaire's quiet dignity for a lack of toughness, a fatal misreading of a man whose own power was derived not from loud pronouncements, but from a profound and often silent understanding of human character. The collision, as it so often does, was born of a profound and arrogant misinterpretation. Whitman believed he was performing for Mr. Tanaka, that he was demonstrating the kind of ruthless, unsentimental strength that a fellow titan of industry would surely respect. He believed he was showcasing his own power by casually and publicly diminishing hers. He did not and could not understand that he was, in fact, doing the exact opposite. He was providing Mr. Tanaka with a live, unvarnished and utterly damning demonstration of his own profound character flaws. He was revealing himself to be a man who relied on cheap, cruel theatrics to feel powerful, a man who saw prejudice as a tool, and a man who was so blinded by his own sense of superiority that he was incapable of seeing the true, formidable strength of the quiet, unassuming woman he was so desperately and foolishly trying to humiliate. The collision was not just an insult, it was a confession. And the one person in the room who truly mattered was listening to every word. Lian's unconventional action was not a fiery retort or a defensive justification. It was an act of profound strategic redirection. In the face of Whitman's ugly public mockery, she did not engage with him on his own low terms. She simply, and with a quiet, devastating elegance, changed the language of the entire encounter. By addressing Mr. Tanaka directly in flawless academic Mandarin, she was not just showcasing a hidden skill, she was fundamentally altering the power dynamics of the room. She was bypassing Whitman completely, creating a direct, exclusive channel of communication with the true center of power at the table. In that single, brilliant stroke, she transformed herself from the object of the conversation to its facilitator. She was no longer the waitress being discussed. She was the expert, the translator, the one who held the key to the very understanding Whitman was so desperately trying to control. Her decision to then expose the translation error in the contract was the final, brilliant twist of the knife. It was not a personal attack. It was a professional one. She was not just defending her own honor. She was protecting the integrity of the deal itself. She was demonstrating, in the most practical and undeniable way possible, that her skills were not just an interesting party trick, but a vital, and in this case, multi-million-dollar asset. The seed of doubt was planted not in Whitman's mind. He was too consumed by his own fury and humiliation to see the strategic genius of what had just happened, but in Mr. Tanaka's. The Japanese billionaire was a man who had built his empire on a deep, almost intuitive understanding of people. He had come to this dinner to evaluate not just a company, but a man. And he had just witnessed that man, Richard Whitman, commit two of the cardinal sins of international business. He had shown a profound lack of cultural sensitivity, and he had been caught in a blatant and rather clumsy act of deception. Conversely, he had just seen a young, unassuming woman whom Whitman had treated as less than nothing display a level of linguistic skill, professional poise and ethical courage that was, in his experience, exceptionally rare. The seed of doubt was a single, simple, and now unavoidable question. Who was the real professional at this table? Was it the loud, arrogant, and clearly deceitful American CEO? Or was it the quiet, dignified, and terrifyingly competent waitress? Mr. Tanaka looked from Whitman's sputtering, red-faced fury to Lian's calm, composed professionalism, and in his mind, the $500 million question of the evening was no longer about the deal. It was about the woman who had just, with a single, devastatingly elegant sentence, saved him from it. He was no longer just an investor. He was a deeply intrigued and highly suspicious detective, and the case of the brilliant hidden waitress had just been officially and irrevocably opened. At that moment, the powerful CEO realized the waitress he had just mocked was not a victim, but the quiet, unseen judge of his entire career. If you believe that true power lies not in the volume of your voice but in the depth of your knowledge, give us a like to support Lian's journey, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The dinner did not end. It transformed. The atmosphere, which had been a mixture of feigned bonhomie and tense negotiation, now became a quiet, high-stakes, and deeply surreal interrogation, with Mr. Tanaka Kenji as the lead detective and Lian Chen as his star and entirely unexpected witness. With a single calm gesture, Mr. Tanaka waved off the flustered, apologetic restaurant manager who was hovering nearby, ready to eject Lian at Whitman's command. "She stays," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the unshakable weight of a man who had just decided to take control of the evening. He then gestured to the empty chair beside him, an invitation that was, in fact, a command. "Ms. Chen, please, join us." Richard Whitman watched, speechless and horrified, as the woman he had just tried to humiliate was elevated with a single quiet gesture to a position of honor at his own table. She moved with a calm, unhurried grace, her earlier deferential posture replaced by a new, quiet confidence. She was no longer a server, she was a consultant, an expert witness, and the entire multi-billion-dollar deal now hinged on her every word. The investigation began not with accusations, but with a series of quiet, probing questions, all directed at Lian, all in Mandarin. Mr. Tanaka did not ask her about the contract again. Instead, he asked her about herself. "You have a remarkable command of the Beijing dialect," he began, his tone now one of a scholar conversing with a peer. "Your accent is flawless. Where did you study?" Lian, understanding that this was a test of her authenticity, a way for him to gauge the truth of who she was, answered with a simple, unadorned honesty. She spoke of her time at Johns Hopkins, of her fellowship, of her love for the intricate, beautiful logic of the language. As she spoke, Whitman sat in a state of impotent, silent fury. The conversation was happening around him, through him, in a language he could not understand, a world he could not enter. He was a king who had suddenly become a peasant in his own court, a silent, irrelevant spectator to a dialogue that was, he knew with a sickening certainty, deciding his fate. He had tried to use language as a weapon, and now it was being used as a shield, a fortress, protecting the two people at the table who truly mattered, and locking him firmly and irrevocably on the outside. The investigation had begun, and he was its primary and most helpless subject. As Mr. Tanaka's quiet, respectful questions continued, the layers of Lian Chen's hidden life were slowly, elegantly peeled back. She was no longer just a linguistic prodigy. She was an expert in the very field in which he and Whitman were operating. "My thesis," she explained in Mandarin, in response to a question from Tanaka about her academic focus, was an analysis of the legal and financial ramifications of the 2008 collapse of the Sino-Global Shipping Consortium. Specifically, the role that deceptively translated contractual clauses played in the company's insolvency. Richard Whitman, who was catching only fragments of the conversation through his now useless company translator, felt a fresh wave of cold dread. The woman he had mocked for her accent was now, in a language he couldn't understand, discussing the esoteric, high-stakes world of international contract law. Mr. Tanaka, however, was captivated. "That was a brilliant piece of scholarship," he said, his eyes alight with a new, profound respect. "I read it. It was required reading for my own legal team. I had no idea the author was here." The hero's secret was not just her fluency, it was her formidable and directly relevant expertise. She was not just a woman who could speak the language, she was one of the few people in the world who understood, on a granular academic level, the very specific and very insidious type of trap that Whitman had just tried to set. Whitman, feeling the conversation slipping even further from his grasp, tried to interject. "Tanaka-san," he began, his voice a desperate, strained attempt at his old, confident bonhomie. "Perhaps we should return to the matter at hand, the terms of our own partnership." Mr. Tanaka did not even look at him. He simply held up a hand, a quiet, dismissive gesture that silenced Whitman more effectively than any shout. He then turned back to Lian, his voice now a low, confidential murmur. "Ms. Chen," he said, switching back to English, a deliberate and cutting act of inclusion for Whitman. "Given your unique expertise in this area, what is your professional opinion of the document that Mr. Whitman has presented to us this evening?" The question was a quiet, formal handing over of the gavel. He was no longer just a witness. He was now the expert, the judge, and the jury. She had not come here to be a hero. She had come here to serve justice for her father. And now, the man she had intended to save had just, with a single elegant question, handed her the sword. Lian did not reach for the contract with a flourish. She did not need to. She had read its treacherous familiar language in the quiet, pre-dawn hours in her small apartment, and its words were seared into her memory. She looked directly at Richard Whitman, her gaze no longer that of a server, but of a prosecutor delivering her closing argument. "The trap, Mr. Whitman," she began, her voice a calm, even instrument of intellectual demolition, "is not a new invention. It is in fact a remarkably faithful reproduction of a strategy you first deployed 20 years ago." She then turned her attention to Mr. Tanaka, her voice now a clear, concise narrative of a past crime. 20 years ago, she said, Mr. Whitman's company entered into a similar partnership with a small, family-owned import-export business called Chen Imports. The owner, a brilliant but trusting man, was presented with a contract in 2 languages, just as you were tonight. Whitman, at the mention of the name Chen Imports, went rigid. The color drained from his face. It was a name he thought he had successfully buried, a ghost from a past he had long since erased. The English version of that contract, Lian continued, her voice never wavering, spoke of a joint venture, of shared profits, of mutual growth. But the translated version, the one presented to Mr. Chen, contained a series of small, almost imperceptible, but legally binding linguistic differences. A partnership became a subsidiary. Shared profits became performance-based dividends payable at the discretion of the primary shareholder, and a mutual termination clause became a majority owner buyout option. The buried truth was a story of pure, predatory deception. It was the story of a man who had used the very beauty and complexity of language as a weapon, who had turned a bridge of communication into a trap door. Within 6 months, Lian concluded, her eyes now burning with a cold, righteous fire, Whitman Enterprises had invoked the clauses in the translated contract, triggering a hostile takeover. They absorbed Chen Imports, liquidated its assets, and left its owner with nothing but a mountain of debt and a legal bill he could not possibly pay. She paused, letting the full, devastating weight of the story settle upon the silent, stunned table. "That man," she said, her voice now dropping to a quiet, almost personal whisper, "was my father. And the stress of that betrayal, the shame of that public ruin, it killed him. He died less than a year later." The trap was not just a clause in a contract. It was a 20-year-old crime, a story of a life's work stolen, of a good man's spirit broken. And the woman who sat before them was not just an expert witness. She was the last living testament to that crime. She was the ghost of Chen Imports, returned not for revenge, but for a long and terrible and finally inescapable reckoning. Richard Whitman, faced with the ghost of a crime he thought was long buried, did not crumble. He did not confess. Years of ruthless, consequence-free living had calcified his conscience. His first instinct was not remorse, but a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. He was not a man being brought to justice. He was a king being challenged by a peasant, and his reaction was swift and brutal. He rose to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The mask of the charming, sophisticated CEO dissolved, revealing the raw, ugly snarl of a cornered predator. "This is an outrage," he boomed, his voice a shocking, violent eruption in the quiet, elegant restaurant. A preposterous, slanderous, and clearly orchestrated attack. He turned his full, venomous attention on Lian. "You," he spat, his finger jabbing the air, "are a liar, a bitter, opportunistic little nobody, using the sad, pathetic story of your father's business failures to extort a man you think you can intimidate." He was no longer trying to win the deal. He was trying to win the room, to reclaim the narrative, to paint himself as the victim of a vindictive, delusional woman. He turned to his own legal team, who were sitting in a state of stunned, horrified paralysis. "Are you going to just sit there?" he roared. "She has just publicly accused me of fraud. I want her sued. I want her ruined. I want her thrown out of this restaurant and out of this city." It was a classic bullying tactic, an attempt to use the sheer volume of his rage and the weight of his power to crush the quiet, inconvenient truth. He was a man who believed that if you shouted loud enough, you could make the truth disappear. But his counterattack was not just a verbal assault, it was a threat. As his voice rose, he took a step toward Lian, his body language a clear, unmistakable promise of physical intimidation. He was a man who had lost control, and in that moment, the entire, glittering, civilized restaurant held its breath, waiting to see if the violence of his words would spill over into the violence of his actions. He was not just denying a crime, he was, in his own brutish way, threatening to commit another one, right here, in front of the whole watching world. As Whitman's rage filled the room, a raw, uncontrolled force, an unexpected and powerful ally emerged. It was not a person who rose to Lian's defense. It was the quiet, almost sacred code of honor that governed Mr. Tanaka Kenji's world. The Japanese billionaire, who had been a silent, watchful observer to the entire unfolding drama, now moved. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply, and with a quiet, deliberate grace, rose to his feet. He picked up his linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside his plate. He then gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow in Lian's direction, a gesture of profound, and in this context, devastating respect. Then he turned and began to walk away from the table. His entire entourage, with the silent, synchronized precision of a royal court, followed his lead. They rose, they bowed, and they turned their backs on Richard Whitman. The act was a quiet, brutal, and utterly final judgment. In Mr. Tanaka's world, a world of honor, of saving face, of a man's word being his bond, Richard Whitman had not just committed a crime, he had committed a profound and unforgivable social sin. He had lost his composure. He had revealed himself to be a man of no honor, no discipline, no self-control. His wealth, his power, his company, it was all in that single, silent moment of judgment, rendered utterly and completely irrelevant. Mr. Tanaka had not just walked away from a deal. He had, with a quiet, devastating finality, walked away from him. He had, in the most public and unmistakable way possible, declared him to be a man unworthy of respect, a man unworthy of a seat at the table. The unexpected ally was not a person, but a principle. The principle that true power is not in the ability to shout, but in the discipline to remain silent. The principle that true wealth is not in a bank account, but in one's own unshakable honor. It was a principle that Richard Whitman, in his loud, ugly, and ultimately self-defeating rage, had just proven he would never, ever understand. And as he stood alone at the now empty table, the silence that rushed in to fill the void was the sound of his own complete and irreversible ruin. The final, devastating piece of evidence was not a document, not a recording, but an act of quiet, almost anticlimactic, technological betrayal. As Mr. Tanaka and his entourage were making their silent, dignified exit from the restaurant, the young, tech-savvy associate who had been quietly taking notes on his tablet throughout the evening paused at the door. He did not look at Whitman. He looked at Lian, and with a small, respectful nod, he held up his tablet. On the screen was a single, elegantly designed QR code. He then turned and followed his employer, leaving the code and its silent, explosive potential hanging in the air. Lian, with a quiet, almost imperceptible nod of her own, understood. She took out her own, simple, unassuming smartphone. She opened her camera app, a tool she had been using for years, not to take selfies, but to document, to record, to gather evidence. She held the phone up, and with a soft, almost inaudible click, she scanned the QR code. The link it opened was not to a corporate website or a financial report. It was a link to a secure, encrypted, and utterly damning digital archive. It was Mr. Tanaka's own private and meticulously compiled due diligence file on Richard Whitman. For months, as he had been considering the deal, Mr. Tanaka's team of forensic accountants and corporate investigators had been conducting a deep-dive investigation into Whitman's entire business history. They had been looking not just at his profits, but at his methods, and it was all there. There were the financial records from Chen Imports, 20 years old, showing the systematic, deliberate siphoning of funds that had led to her father's bankruptcy. There were the sworn, notarized affidavits from two other small business owners, men who had also been ruined by Whitman's deceptively translated contracts. But the final and most damning piece of evidence was a series of emails obtained by Mr. Tanaka's investigators from a disgruntled former employee of Whitman's law firm. The emails between a young Richard Whitman and his even more ruthless attorney laid out the entire predatory strategy in cold, hard, and undeniable detail. The key, one of Whitman's own emails read, is in the nuance. We give them an English contract that sings of partnership and a translated one that screams of servitude. By the time they understand the difference, it will be too late. The beauty of it is that it's all perfectly legal. It was a confession, a signed, sealed, and delivered testament to a lifetime of predatory and, until now, perfectly concealed corporate crime. It was the smoking gun. It was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence that would not just end Richard Whitman's career, but would, in all likelihood, send him to prison. And it had been delivered not with a shout, but with a quiet, elegant, and technologically brilliant act of silent digital justice. Richard Whitman stood alone in the wreckage of his own making, the silence of the now empty restaurant a deafening roar in his ears. Mr. Tanaka's quiet, devastating exit had been a public execution. His own colleagues, who had a moment ago been his loyal lieutenants, were now avoiding his gaze, their faces a mixture of fear and a dawning, terrible comprehension. But the final killing blow was delivered not by an enemy, but by the quiet, unassuming woman he had so foolishly and fatefully underestimated. Lian Chen did not leave with Mr. Tanaka. She remained at the table, a silent, watchful presence. She looked down at her phone, at the digital archive of his crimes, at the irrefutable, damning proof of his life's work. Then she stood. She did not walk over to him. She simply, and with a quiet, devastating finality, forwarded the entire encrypted file. She sent it to the senior partners at Whitman's own law firm. She sent it to the chairman of his board of directors. She sent it to the lead financial crimes reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And she sent a final, separate and specially marked copy to the Office of the United States Attorney for the Southern District of California. The curtain had not just fallen, it had been incinerated. With a few silent taps on a screen, she had just, in the space of 10 seconds, initiated a multi-front war that he could not possibly survive. The lawsuits, the federal investigations, the public disgrace, it was all now in motion, a quiet, digital avalanche that he had no power to stop. She then looked at him, one last time, her expression not one of triumph, not of hatred, but of a quiet, profound, and almost sorrowful finality. "My father," she said, her voice a low, clear whisper that was for him and for him alone, was a good man. He believed in the power of a handshake, of a person's word. You taught him that the world was a crueler, more treacherous place than he had imagined. And today, she concluded, her gaze as steady and as unforgiving as a judge's, I have simply returned the lesson. And then she turned and walked away, her footsteps a soft, steady rhythm against the polished floor, the sound of a 20-year-old debt being, at last and in full, repaid. The collapse was not a slow decline, it was a free fall. In the hours and days that followed the disastrous dinner, Richard Whitman's world was systematically and mercilessly dismantled. The digital dossier Lian had unleashed was a perfectly engineered virus, and it spread through the corporate and legal world with a swift, unstoppable efficiency. By the next morning, his board had convened an emergency session. They did not invite him. By noon, he had been suspended, his access to the company he had built revoked. By the end of the week, he had been formally and unceremoniously fired, his name stripped from the letterhead, his legacy reduced to a toxic liability. The justice was not just corporate, it was criminal. The U.S. Attorney's Office, armed with the irrefutable evidence from Mr. Tanaka's investigators and the emails from Whitman's own past, moved with a speed that was breathtaking. He was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, racketeering, and corporate malfeasance. His assets were frozen. His empire, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled into a ruin of legal fees and public disgrace. But the real justice, the one that was most profound, was not the one that was meted out in a courtroom. It was the one that was quietly, and with a beautiful poetic irony, unfolding in the wake of his collapse. Mr. Tanaka Kenji, a man who valued honor above all else, did not just walk away from the deal. He saw an opportunity. He saw a company, Whitman Enterprises, that was now wounded, vulnerable, and in desperate need of a new and more ethical vision. He approached Lian Chen not with a job offer, but with a partnership proposal. He would use his considerable capital to acquire a controlling stake in the now floundering company. But he would not run it. He wanted her to. "You, Ms. Chen," he had said in a quiet meeting in his own serene and exquisitely appointed boardroom, "understand the soul of this company, both its light and its shadow, more than anyone. You have earned the right to remake it in your own image, an image of integrity, of honor, of a new and better way of doing business. And so, in a move that stunned the entire financial world, Lian Chen, the quiet, unassuming waitress, the daughter of the man the company had destroyed, became the new CEO of the very empire that had crushed her family. The justice was not just that the villain had been vanquished. It was that the hero, in the end, had inherited the kingdom. The dawn of the new era at the company, now officially and publicly rebranded as Chen Legacy Holdings, was not a quiet, tentative sunrise. It was a bold, brilliant, and transformative one. Lian Chen, as its new CEO, did not just change the letterhead. She fundamentally re-engineered the company's soul. Her first act was not to fire the old guard, but to re-educate them. She implemented a new, mandatory and company-wide code of conduct, a document that was less a legal treatise and more a philosophical one. It was based on a simple, revolutionary principle: radical transparency. Every contract, every negotiation, every deal would be conducted with a level of honesty and clarity that was almost unheard of in their industry. Her next move was to establish the Chen Imports Restitution Fund, a multi-million-dollar initiative funded by the company's own profits, to compensate the other small businesses and entrepreneurs who, like her father, had been a victim of Richard Whitman's predatory practices. It was not just an act of charity, it was a public and profound act of corporate atonement. But her most significant innovation was in the company's own culture. She transformed the cold, competitive, and deeply toxic environment of the old Whitman enterprises into a place of collaborative and genuinely respectful innovation. She promoted from within, elevating the quiet, competent, and often overlooked employees who had been marginalized under Whitman's reign. She established a new company-wide language program, offering free in-house classes in Mandarin, Spanish, and Japanese to every employee, from the mailroom to the boardroom. She was not just running a company, she was building a bridge. The new dawn was not just for the company, it was for Lian herself. The quiet, all-consuming quest for justice that had defined her entire adult life was over. And in the quiet space that was left behind, she found something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. A sense of peace, of a future that was not defined by the ghosts of the past. She was no longer a hunter, she was a builder. And the work she was doing was not about avenging her father's death. It was about honoring his life, his spirit, his belief in the power of a good, clean, and honest deal. 1 year later, on a crisp, bright Los Angeles afternoon, Lian Chen stood on the stage of a university auditorium. She was not there as a CEO, but as a keynote speaker for the graduating class of the university's International Business School. She wore not a power suit, but a simple, elegant dress, and at her collar she wore not a diamond, but her father's old, worn fountain pen, converted into a simple, beautiful pin. She spoke not of profits and losses, but of a different kind of balance sheet. She spoke of the currency of trust, of the long-term investment of integrity, of the incalculable value of a good name. And she told them a story. She told them the story of a brilliant, trusting man named Chen, an importer who had believed in the power of a handshake. She told them of his betrayal, of his ruin, and she told them of his legacy. "My father," she said, her voice a clear, resonant instrument that filled the large, silent hall, "lost his business, but he never, ever lost his honor. And in the end, I have learned that honor is the one true and enduring asset. It is the only legacy that can never be stolen, never be devalued, and never, ever be erased. In the front row of the auditorium, a quiet, unassuming man in his late 60s sat listening. It was Mr. Tanaka Kenji. He had flown in from Tokyo for this, to bear witness to the final triumphant chapter of a story he had helped to write. He was not just a former business associate. He had become a mentor, a friend, a quiet, steady presence in Lian's new life. After her speech, as a new generation of business leaders rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation, he simply smiled, a quiet, knowing smile of a man who had made the best and most profitable investment of his life. The legacy of Lian Chen and her father was not a story of revenge. It was a story of redemption. It was not about the fall of a bad man, but about the rise of a good and great woman. It was a testament to the idea that the quiet, patient, and often invisible work of building a life of integrity is, in the end, the most powerful and enduring force in the world. And as Lian stood on that stage, bathed in the warm, bright light of a future she had built herself, she was not just her father's daughter. She was his legacy, come to full and brilliant and beautiful life.